I've gotten this question a lot. I'll probably keep getting it. Should the Vikings take a wide receiver or a cornerback? Maybe something else? Let's lay it all out on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You like that on 3, 1, 2, 3. You like it!
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at LukeBraunNFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Of course, you can also find this show on Amazon Fire or Roku. Just download the Locked On Minnesota Sports app. Today on the show, I'm going to go into maybe a larger discussion about like BPA versus need and all of that stuff, perhaps at a later date. I've done that episode before on this show, so if you just want to go to around this time of year in a previous year, you can find my thoughts on that. They may have evolved a little bit, though. At any rate, really, I've gotten this question in some form for Twitter Tuesdays before, and I always get something like this, and you say something like, well, so if Jordan Addison, first wideout that came to mind, and Kelee, Ringo are there at the same time, who do you take, right? And usually for the question in the question asker's mind, those two players are equal. And you say, okay, an equal wideout and an equal corner. Who do you take? Essentially asking, would you rather have a wideout or a corner? If you ask that point blank, my answer will always be, well, it depends on who's the guy. Who are the guys? So they're telling me who are the guys, and then I answer there. So my answer to that is always going to be, who are the players? There is no such thing as the kind of tie where I have to start going to tie-breaking stuff like, well, would you rather have a 22-year-old or a 23-year-old? Or what? Like, I'm always going to be about, okay, like taking all of these prospects in as a singular entity, as a conglomerate. You cannot pick these guys apart and only take some of their traits without the others. So I'm always going to compare them as entire packages to each other. And so my answer to that question, no matter who it is always going to be, well, where do they rank on my board? And if I rank them next to each other. So a little later in the show, I'm going to do that with the two guys that I've talked about, or that I've scouted that I haven't talked about yet, which are Kelee, Ringo and Quentin, Johnston. And where I rank those two guys next to each other. I'm sure you have your own opinions on that, and I'm definitely not going to try to change them. I'll just give you mine. But the idea of wide receiver versus corner is still one of the main talkers going into draft season. What is the Vikings' biggest need? I got into a back and forth with Tyler Forness about this a while ago, and he's written a bunch of articles about it. And what I'll say is biggest need to me, it means what's the thing they need to pour the most resources into? Or I guess you could also define that as what is the thing that hurts them the most if they do not address it, right? And those might be two separate things. I'll go with the latter because the former might have more to do with who the class is, right? There are a lot of good corners in free agency this year. So that might mean even if you think that getting a wide receiver is more important to the Vikings, getting a corner is a more efficient use of resources, so they should spend more on that. Or you think that this is a better wide receiver class, so they should draft one in the first round, which is actually a pretty common take. Draft a receiver in the first round, and then the middle band of corners is super thick, so draft two on day two. And that's actually a strategy I'm pretty sympathetic to. So I think it's worth pointing out that with wide receiver and corner, if the Vikings don't add a wide receiver, let's say that Adam Thielen takes a pay cut, he stays, and the Vikings run back with the same skill group that they had last year: Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, KJ Osborne, TJ Hawkinson, and whatever they do at running back. Let's say it's Dalvin Cook. They don't do anything, right? Let's say they keep that same core 5 skill players. That is fine. Yeah, you might want to get a little younger. You might want to try to get your succession plan for Adam Thielen, and that's obviously a good idea. But if they don't do that, nobody is breaking any glass in case of emergency. Nobody is hitting any eject buttons, right? If they don't get a corner, it's rough. That's unacceptable, right? If you don't touch the wide receiver room for 2 years, let's say, Adam Thielen leaves, KJ Osborne leaves, you're left with Justin Jefferson, next best guys like Jalen Naylor. That's an emergency. The cornerback room is still in worse shape than that wide receiver room would be if you didn't do anything to it for 2 years. And I'm talking about in the current moment. They don't have to play a game tomorrow, thank goodness. So they've got lots of time to fix this, but they will have to. And therefore, I believe that corner is the bigger need for the Vikings. In a vacuum, and none of these decisions ever exist in that vacuum, so this isn't all that useful, but I'll still say it because people are interested. In a vacuum, I see wide receiver and corner as like really, really close in terms of positional importance. If your wide receivers are important, covering those wide receivers is pretty much just as important to me. And you can make arguments about how like corner is a little bit more unstable, but I have a weird prediction that I think as analytics get better and better and more big datable things will come, I think the corner will undergo the same transformation that like nose tackle did, where I think we will find a better way to think about it and a better way to measure it. And we'll find a way to say, oh, wait, now it is more stable. We just didn't quite have those measures yet. I don't know what that looks like, and I don't know how long it takes, but I do think that there is still meat on that bone that eventually someone's going to figure out. And when that happens, it'll be pretty cool. So I think corner is a bigger need for the Vikings, but you can never have too many corners. You can never have too many wideouts, and it's always going to come down to who those guys are and how well they fit the Vikings and all the things that you usually put into a draft scout. All of that stuff matters, and all of it has to come as a package. So I cannot look at this and say, well, if there's an 88 as a corner, but there's an 86 as a wide receiver, or vice versa, does that change? No, I'm taking the 88. If you want to compare, if we're talking quarterbacks versus running backs, maybe it's a little bit different. But where I'm going to end up on this, and it's going to take me a long time because I'm taking my time with these prospects this year. But where I end up on with this is that I'm going to have the wide receiver class as much of it as I've watched, and the cornerback class as much of it as I've watched. And I will compare them all to each other, and eventually I will have them in a big board order where I say, well, I'll take this guy over this guy, that guy over that guy, that guy over that guy, right? And I'll do the exercise that basically I'm going to do for the rest of this show, which is looking at two guys, Quentin Johnston and Kelee Ringo, and saying, okay, both of them are on the board. You don't want anyone else. Which two would you take, right? Or which guy would you take, right? So I'll talk about my scouting reports for those guys and how much I want them to be Vikings. And they're both, I think, going to be pretty controversial players coming up in this draft. So which is why I'm kind of hiding them in a greater discussion, because I don't want this to be all about those takes. But I will give you those takes and you can run with them and do whatever you want. Cold take me 3 years later when I don't like one guy and he turns out to be a total stud, right? That's the game. So we'll get into that. But first, let me talk to you about America's #1 sportsbook. It is FanDuel. It is always Grambling season. Football season's over. That doesn't mean you have to stop grambling. In fact, you can still gamble on stuff like the draft, like who first round picks will be and stuff. And you can also just go bet on basketball or hockey. The NBA season in particular is in its midpoint. And if you haven't signed up for FanDuel yet, now is a great time because new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. Safe, secure, and super easy to use. You can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers and threes drained. You can even combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thanks so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. At the end of the month, go check out patreon.com/LukeBraun NFL. I'm going to open it back up for signups, and we can all scout draft prospects together. I'll have tape breakdowns on everybody I talk about on the podcast. If you are a more visual learner, you want to see a little bit more about what I'm talking about, drawn on it like the telestrator and stuff, then we can all do that together. But for now, audio will have to do. we should talk about Kelee Ringo. I'm going to start with him, and he's the corner out of Georgia, and he is going to be mocked to the Vikings a lot, I think, because I don't think he's going to end up as high as like Christian Gonzalez. I think Christian Gonzalez is going in the top 15, right? Maybe top 10 or top 5 if you're really high on him. Ringo, I think, is going to slip a little bit, and then the combine is going to happen, and he's going to shoot back up. His grinding the mocks page should be very interesting in like a month or two. So Kelee Ringo is going to be your classic young, hyper athletic, hyper raw corner. He's, I think, going to be 20 on the day by the time the season starts. He's a puppy, right? And he plays like a puppy. There's all kinds of things about his game that are just not experienced enough to be like really viable. But he's crazy fast. He's big. He's physical. He has all the athleticism you could ever want. So when it's underwear Olympics time, he's going to totally blow it out, right? And for cornerbacks, I do think the 40-yard dash is a little underrated. I think the 10 split of that 40-yard dash is a much better indicator. And I do believe that has held up when people do like analytics with it. I think the agility drills matter a lot. I think the bench press matters a lot more than people want to give it credit for, because you do end up with that kind of that same pushing motion. It simulates press coverage a little bit. And then of course, you want to see the workouts and all that, the vertical, the jumps. You want to see like explosiveness. I am curious to see what happens with Kelee Ringo, but for Ringo, what I think you need to know is that he plays like a guy who never had to really learn the right techniques outside of a couple that are really polished. Like outside of that, you can tell what he's focused on. And I don't think he ever had to focus on anything more because he was just that much faster than everybody for like the whole time he's been playing football, which is high school and 2 years at Georgia. So like, this is not much, right? Like when it is a foot race, like something like he's in press and it's a go route and he's just playing press coverage with no jam. He is effortless in how easy it is for him to keep up. And that actually comes into play if he ever loses off the line of scrimmage or he gets, beat. He gets beat missing with a jam. There's a play where he like tries to press jam someone. He totally whiffs on it. He turns around, he catches right up, and it ends up being the play ends up being a dub. And it looks like he's only ever running about 65%. I'm not sure I ever saw him run at 100%. I watched 3 or 4 games of his. I don't think I saw him run 100% once because I don't think he had to. And he'll have to in the NFL. But again, like that like I am curious to see what his top end speeds ends up being. But man, it looks like a guy that's going to run a 4.35 and Rich Eisen will burst into flames. Like, I think he's really, really, really going to blow it up. And what's crazy about that is that he's a big body guy. When you look at 40 times, when teams like NFL analytic departments, when they look at 40 times and the jumps and all of that stuff, they're weight adjusting all of this, right? And for his size and his weight, that's going to be even more impressive. And it's going to make a lot of people really, really, really excited about him. You're going to hear the word potential, like sky high potential about him a lot. And maybe you can tell that I'm kind of setting up for this, but I'm not sure if I believe in his ability to reach all of that potential unless I see some stuff change really fast or see certain things in workouts. For example, his technique, and in particular his feet at the line of scrimmage, leave much to be desired. I cannot stand the way he uses his feet unless it's somebody is releasing outside him on a go route. That he's got. That's really smooth, and he can transition, get his hips flipped, get going downfield, and then run at 65% while the other guy's chugging along as well as he can, and he can be in the guy's pocket, right? But when it's like you really see this on the goal line plays, I think Oregon really killed him. Ohio State really killed him on this too. But those are really messy, and it's mostly because, and this is a greater problem, not just on the line of scrimmage, he will overreact before he underreacts. Now, if you remember me talking about Christian Gonzalez, I said the opposite about Christian Gonzalez, and I said that's a good thing. I would much rather have my corners underreact than overreact, right? If you if you're biting on everything, you're getting dusted. That's Andrew Booth. If you're letting guys do stuff in front of you, you might be giving up catches, but you're not busting coverages and giving up touchdowns. That's Caleb Evans. That's why Caleb Evans started over Andrew Booth. And I think for this particular trait, the sort of same dynamic is at play here. Kelee Ringo is biting on things, overreacting to things, taking one too many steps, taking the cheese a little bit too often, whereas Christian Gonzalez would let a little bit more happen in front of him, and he wouldn't underreact all that often, but if he was going to miss short, if you will. Kelee Ringo will get dusted on that stuff, and I think it's not like a gullibility thing. It's not like, oh, he can't read what wide receivers are doing, because nobody can. That's not really what playing corner is. It's more about technique and footwork and about keeping yourself set up so that if they are going to break inside you, you don't have to book it with all of your might to get there, only to realize that he's cutting it upfield and it was like a slant and go or something. Perhaps the best player to compare him to for this, to illustrate the point, is Duke Shelley. Just because he's so fresh in all of our minds, right? Duke Shelley, 5'9". I think he ran like a 4.5, 5.40. This dude is absolutely not an elite NFL athlete. But because his feet were really sound, there was absolutely no wasted motion, and he would rather underreact than overreact, he ended up having a really great season on the outside until the playoffs. The playoff game didn't go great for him. But he ended up kind of outplaying that athleticism like by quite a bit. And I think right now, Kelee Ringo is very much underplaying his athleticism. And the worst thing for me with Ringo is his change of direction skills. In particular, against comeback routes, when he has his hips turned and he is running with you as though it's a go route, he can run with you forever. But the second you break down and turn around like it's a comeback or a curl, it's like the scene from Austin Powers when he's got the little cart and he's trying to turn it around in the hall and he's got to go back. Like, it is that unagile. It's really, really horrible. It takes him too many steps. He's got too much momentum. He's got too much. I think it's like he's just got too much inertia. Like, that big body is hard to slow down and then get back going up. And all of this means that he can often find himself, if he's driving at things too much, if he doesn't have good feet on the line of scrimmage, if he doesn't have good feet at route breaks, it means he's out of position a lot. And he has a pretty bad habit of grabbing. I think he did have a bit of a penalty issue at Georgia. He's a grabby guy, and it's a panic habit. It's not like a reliable or like a thing he's like relying on every play. Like it was with that's what sank a Caleb Evans down to the fourth round, is that he would grab constantly. And that was like how he played corner, and you kind of had to reteach him how to play corner. With Ringo, it only happens when he's out of position, and it's like his last ditch effort to try to get you is to just reach out, grab your arm, and try to pull you back and get back in the play that way. And you're just never going to get away with that in the NFL. It's just something that you just have to take your L in the NFL, and he has to learn that. So he's got these grabbies. And then every once in a while, there's just, I've got a section in my little cut up that's just called like bozo stuff. There's a rep where he turns his eyes all the way upfield before the receiver has gotten there. Usually, you turn your hips when the receiver gets to you so that you can keep him in your field of vision. You don't give him a blind spot. He does it like 2 steps early, gives up a huge blind spot, corner or the wide receiver cuts inside him, and he's like totally dusted, right? Stuff like that. Stuff like losing the ball. Losing the ball and like ball tracking in general, he's given up some contested catches that way. It's like a lot of stuff. And when the play comes down to, can you keep up with the guy? Like, can you keep up with a burner, right? You put this dude up against Christian Watson running a go route, he'll be able to cover it 100 times out of 100. But the second he sees a savvy route runner, the second somebody wants to set him up outside, the second somebody, like Justin Jefferson tries to sell that it's a corner route, but it's really a post route, and, prey on his film study and all that stuff, he's going to have a really bad time. And so for that reason, I'm like kind of out on him. To me, he's a project. You got to fix his feet. You got to fix his eyes. You got to fix his change of direction. You got to fix his grabbies. That's so much stuff to fix. You cannot put this dude on the field day one. And if you can't put that dude on the field day one, I feel really uncomfortable making him a top 10, top 15 pick like everybody's saying. So I'm probably going to be a lot lower on Kelee Ringo than everybody else is. But we got another guy to talk about, which is Quentin Johnston, who is also a very controversial guy. And I want to give you my 2 cents, I suppose. So he is next. First, let me talk to you about the best phone game on my phone, the best app on my phone right now, and that is Ultimate Football GM. If you want to play for yourself, go through the draft, go through contracts, hire the right coaches. Ultimate Pro Football GM is a football team simulator. It scratches that offseason itch for everybody that thinks they can do it better than all the NFL teams. Well, go do it, and you can even start a league with your friends. We had a Locked On League this year. Christopher Carter, who does Locked On Steelers, won it, and I hate him for that. But all of this exists in a challenging and realistic game world. I've heard a whole bunch of stories of people who signed all the players, won a Super Bowl, and then they were like, then I was 75 million over the cap and everything fell apart. You got to avoid that situation. And hey, Locked On Vikings listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps, so make sure you check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So to kind of put a bow on Kelee Ringo, I struggle to put him in the first round because of everything that is wrong that needs to be fixed. That's probably a really hot take. And maybe after he tests and all the correlations to that athleticisms and stuff, maybe I'll end up bumping that up by the time we get to actual drafts, the actual draft class. And by the way, I don't know where he ranks amongst all the other corners because I've only watched one other one. So subject to a lot of change, but that's where I've got him right now. So let's move on to Quentin Johnston, TCU wide receiver. If you watch the college football playoffs, he was all over it. And he's a really exciting receiver to a lot of people. And then to other people, he's a giant trap. I think Kelee Ringo is a trap. So do I also think Quentin Johnston is a trap? Less so, I guess. So the thing about Quentin Johnston that sticks out to me the most is that he has a very long, lopey stride. He runs like a tall receiver runs, that gazelle thing. I don't want to make, this is not a good comp, but he does share that sort of aesthetic with Randy Moss. He runs like Randy Moss runs. He shares nothing else with Randy Moss, but he runs with that same sort of tempo. And so it never looks like he's at his top speed, but I think he is going to test fast, and I do think he can run fast. He also had to dog it a lot because TCU's quarterback can't throw very deep. So he had to kind of throttle it down quite a bit very often. And so people might mistake him for not being that fast. But for me, what bugs me is that he's not explosive. He's not explosive out of his breaks. He's not explosive off the release. He's not explosive on even in moments where it's a catch and run situation. He's just not accelerating as fast. It's not 0 to 60 in a half a second. I told somebody else when talking about him, he gets up to, he revs up like a 1992 Ford Escort, and he just kind of sputters up. And once he gets to a top speed, it can be something. But it leaves a lot to be desired. So I'm really curious when he tests. I'm going to look directly at that 10 split. If he runs a good 10 split, then I might rethink this, because it might mean, okay, so he's got the athleticism to get up to speed quickly. He's just wasn't using it for whatever reason. And I can kind of go back and re-examine and say, okay, was this a timing thing? Was it a coaching thing? Maybe he does have more ability than I think, and it just wasn't showcased by TCU. And that's what the athletic testing can kind of do for you. And I think another thing kind of in his corner is that he is at least okay at everything. His routes are fine. They are a little vanilla. I think he could use a little more razzle dazzle on some of this stuff. I think he could do a little bit of setup. I think he could watch Justin Jefferson tape and learn a lot. Which that would be cool if he came here and took some tricks out of Jefferson's bag, right? But they're not bad routes. They're just, I see places where he could have done something more, right? He's got good hands. He doesn't have a drops issue, but he's not it's not elite hands. I saw a concentration drop, or maybe two, in the games I could get my hands on. It's all that gives him a really high floor when there's nothing that you're just bad at this, that I see at least. And that means, when you can kind of at least be okay at everything, that's really good for an offensive coordinator, because that means there's no part of a play I can't ask you to do. Makes you a really versatile piece, and it means you're going to be a guy that's going to be on the field every play, and that means you're going to get market share, and that means you're going to get volume, and that means you're going to get fantasy points, right? But I think the biggest thing that stood out to me is that his routes are boring. The way he runs routes is boring. He hits a landmark and he breaks, and that's it. And he's got reasonable enough athleticism to do that. And if your corner sucks, he can get you. But against good corners, against Michigan in particular, whenever he went up against number 5, whoever Michigan number 5 was playing great in that game, had the clamps on him because he was really easy to read, because he wasn't doing anything particularly deceptive. Again, not to hold everybody up to the pedestal of Justin Jefferson, but Justin Jefferson, there's a play that's kind of burned into my mind from last year where he made it look like it was going to be a corner route, because the concept that the Vikings were doing was a subversion on crash. And in crash, where Justin Jefferson lined up, that guy runs a corner route. He made it look like a corner route, put razzle dazzle on it, but it actually was a deep over, and it totally got the safety turned around and he got wide open. And I know I'm right about that because I posted that clip and Justin Jefferson liked it on Twitter. So I know I have that one. That it's so next level, because not only are you saying, oh, you thought I was going right, but I actually went left, but he folds it in to the whole play concept and what, Kevin O'Connell wanted that play to look like crash, and Justin Jefferson made that play look like crash. Maybe even better example was the nasty route from the Colts game that Nate Burleson had that great call on. Had a similar idea. It was kind of supposed to look like look like a return, I believe. And instead it was more of like a flare out kind of thing. So that kind of stuff is really elite from Justin Jefferson. With Quentin Johnston, it's he'll run a post, and then that's fine. It's a fine post. It's okay. It's perfectly functional post. But there's so much more that he could add that could really be more deceptive. And that's what I really want to drive home with him. And then just the lack of athletic explosiveness is really concerning. There's one route where it's a blaze out, which is you're supposed to kind of drift inward. Adam Thielen is the god of this. Julio Jones was the god of this, but Thielen and Diggs were great at it when they were both kind of in their primes, like 2018-ish. You drift inside, and then it's an out. So it's like a 15-yard out, but you drift the route stem kind of inside to try to carry that corner inside, give yourself more room to break to the outside. For one, Quentin Johnston stems that route straight for a lot of it, and then he just kind of curls it into the inside right at the end. Now, that might be part of the offense. He might be trying to do what Jefferson did, like with a post route or something, which would be super cool. But when he turns it around, he comes out of that break so slow that somebody I was talking to even thought he was like quitting on it. Like he thought the play was over or something. But he comes out of it so slow, and I've seen him come out of it slow and other times too. I think it's just a lack of acceleration that the pass goes right by him. It was not a bad throw. It was to the sideline where it was supposed to be, but he couldn't get out to it because he couldn't get out of that break fast enough. That is probably my biggest concern with him is, can you get out of your breaks fast enough to punish setups if you can learn to do setups? But I think the top speed is going to be perfectly acceptable. There's a couple other points that I didn't really get to. The first guy never tackles him. He's really, really good after the catch, including, you probably remember a highlight if you watched the semifinal game against Michigan where he took a crossing route, made one guy miss and housed it. He does that kind of thing all the time. The first guy never gets him. I really like his juice as a blocker. That's going to matter to the Vikings. And the other thing, he does it a little bit too often for me, is that he jumps when he catches the ball, like unnecessary jumping. And that's just getting a little too excited kind of thing. Easy-ish enough habit to break, but kind of another thing to add to the list. So for Quentin Johnston, on the whole, I don't hate him, but I think if the explosiveness isn't there, I don't think he's a Viking. That doesn't necessarily mean I think he won't work out, but the Vikings want explosion. And I don't know if he has explosions. I don't think he ends up being a Viking. So these are not my favorite two prospects with Kelee Ringo and Quentin Johnston. Right now, if both were available at pick 23, and I'm not allowed to take anybody else or trade down or do anything else, if I just have to choose between these two guys, I'm choosing Quentin Johnston, and I'm doing it with a bullet. Because I think if he does end up being a Viking, I would feel okay about the pick. But just trying to predict what they do, he's not really their kind of guy. And I don't, ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't know if either of these guys are Vikings. Ringo would definitely be a scheme fit. He's a press man corner at heart. But if we draft him, I don't think you're seeing him until 2025. And I don't think that fits with our team's trajectory and particular set of needs. So that's where I fall on those two guys. But hopefully you kind of understand that it's about the two guys. It's not about, in a vacuum, I'd rather have a corner than a wide receiver. But if I'm picking between these two guys, I'd rather have Quentin Johnston than Kelee Ringo. And I hope that makes sense why I kind of came to those conclusions. And by the way, as it always goes with these drafts, I'm an idiot, all right? I'm a podcaster. I'm not a draft scout. I don't work for a football team. I never played all that stuff. So if you disagree and you are way higher on either of these guys than I am, that's perfectly fine. And I'm not going to argue with you. You do your own big board, and you know what? Send it to me when you're done, because I love to see it. We'll talk next week. Whatever happens here, we'll see if we get any cap news, but probably not. I think I'm going to stay in this kind of draft, half like philosophy kind of mode until we start getting news to chew on, and then we'll get to free agency. So see you next week. And as always, Skol.